That is the design. Diffuse the cause. Concentrate the benefit. Distribute the cost across every wallet that holds the currency. Now here is the part that requires attention, because this is where the story stops being about governments and starts being about something older and more precise. When new money enters an economy, it does not distribute evenly. It enters at specific points. It moves through specific channels. And the people closest to those entry points, the ones who receive the new money first, before prices have adjusted to reflect its existence, get to spend it at the old prices. They buy assets, property, equity, commodities, at valuations that have not yet absorbed the new supply. By the time the money has rippled outward through the economy and prices have risen to reflect the expanded supply, the people at the end of that chain, the wage earners, the savers, the people whose wealth is stored in currency rather than in things, are holding dollars that buy less than the dollars they put away. Economists call this the Cantillon effect, named after an 18th-century Irish-French banker named Richard Cantillon who described it in a manuscript that was not published until after his death, possibly because the people who would have found it most inconvenient were the same people in a position to ensure it remained obscure. Whether that is the reason or not, the observation is correct. Those nearest the source of new money gain. Those furthest from it lose. And the distance from the source is not randomly distributed. It maps, with uncomfortable precision, onto existing hierarchies of wealth and access. The person who owns a building gains when money is created, because the building is a real asset and real assets hold value relative to a currency being diluted. The mortgage on the building, if it is fixed, becomes cheaper in real terms over time, the debt shrinks as the currency weakens. The person renting a unit in that building does not own a real asset. The rent adjusts upward to reflect the new price environment. The renter's salary, if it adjusts at all, adjusts later and less completely than prices do. The renter is further from the source. The transfer moves from the renter to the owner, quietly, without anyone in the transaction acknowledging that a transfer is occurring. Multiply this across millions of transactions, across decades, across an entire economy, and you have an explanation for something that looks, on the surface, like a natural outcome, the rich getting richer, that is in fact a mechanical outcome. A predictable result of a system operating exactly as its architects intended, or at minimum, exactly as the people who benefit from it have chosen not to reform. Now sit with that for a moment. Because the argument you will hear, the argument deployed whenever this mechanism is named clearly, is that inflation is not a choice. It is a consequence of complex forces. Of supply chains. Of energy prices. Of consumer demand. Of things beyond any single actor's control. And there is truth in this. Inflation has multiple causes. The system is genuinely complex. Nobody in a single room decided that the purchasing power of ordinary wages would decline over the next 50 years. But complexity is not the same as innocence. And the fact that no single actor decided the outcome does not mean that the outcome was not predictable, was not predicted, was not in some quarters actively preferred. When the people with the power to change a system also benefit from the system as it exists, the probability of meaningful change approaches zero. Not because they are villains who gather in rooms and laugh. Because they are humans who find reasons why the system, as it exists, is actually quite sensible. Because the incentive to understand a problem clearly is much weaker when understanding it clearly would require you to give something up. There is a word for the psychological mechanism by which intelligent people arrive at conclusions that happen to align with their financial interests. The word is rationalization. And it operates below the level of conscious deception. The banker who argues that loose monetary policy is necessary for economic growth is not necessarily lying. He may genuinely believe it. He also happens to be, structurally, one of the primary beneficiaries of the policy he is endorsing. Both things can be true simultaneously. That is what makes the dynamic so durable. It does not require conspiracy. It only requires incentive. Central banks are an instructive case. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, following a period of financial panics that had destabilized the economy and wiped out ordinary depositors. It was presented as a public institution, a stabilizing force, a lender of last resort, a mechanism for smoothing the extremes of the business cycle. What it also was, and what took decades of hindsight to fully articulate, was a system in which private banks had significant input into monetary policy, in which the people setting the rules were drawn from the same institutions that benefited from how those rules were set, and in which the tool most readily deployed in moments of crisis, the expansion of the money supply, had the predictable, documented, theoretically understood effect of benefiting asset holders at the expense of wage earners. This is not a fringe position. It is the conclusion that economists across the political spectrum arrive at when they look carefully at the data over long periods. The disagreement is not about whether the transfer happens. The disagreement is about whether it is a bug or a feature, whether it is correctable, whether the alternatives are worse. These are genuine debates. But they happen in journals and conferences that are not designed for the people most affected by the outcome to participate in or even encounter. Knowledge about how the system works is itself distributed unequally. And that distribution is not random either. Think about what a financial education in an elite institution includes. Not the surface-level content, the vocabulary, the concepts, the frameworks, but the underlying orientation it instills. The assumption that wealth is not just held but managed. That capital is not just stored but deployed. That the goal is not to preserve what you earn but to position it in things that appreciate while the currency in which it was earned slowly loses ground. This orientation is not explicitly taught in most cases. It is absorbed. It is in the air of certain households, certain networks, certain conversations at certain tables. It is the difference between understanding money as a container and understanding money as a current, something that moves, that you can position yourself relative to, that has a direction you can either align with or be carried against. The people who are carried against it rarely know there was a direction to align with. They were never shown the map. They were shown the container. Save what is in the container. Do not spend more than is in the container. Keep the container from going empty. This is sound advice for surviving. It is not a strategy for anything beyond survival. And by the time the container has been slowly emptied by a mechanism its owner did not know existed, the advice was already being followed correctly. The advice was just wrong for the circumstances. Here is what the theft looks like in a life, not in an economy. A woman works for 31 years in the same organization. She saves, consistently, a portion of every paycheck. She does not buy things she cannot afford. She does not carry credit card debt. She lives within her means in the precise way that every financial advice column has ever recommended. At the end of those 31 years, she has a number in an account. The number looks significant. It is larger than any number she ever held when she was young. And it is worth less, in real purchasing terms, than a smaller number held 31 years earlier would have been, because the currency in which it is denominated has been diluted by decades of monetary expansion she did not benefit from, did not understand, was never invited to understand, and had no mechanism to protect herself against because the instruments of protection, inflation-hedged assets, equity, real property, were priced for entry at levels above what careful saving on a single income allowed. She was not robbed in a way the law recognizes. She was not defrauded. No one lied to her. The rules were followed. The transfer happened anyway. And somewhere, in a portfolio managed by people who understand the current and position themselves correctly within it, the equivalent purchasing power she lost ended up. Not because those people are evil. Because they understood something she was never taught. Because they had access to instruments she was priced out of. Because the architecture of the system moved wealth from people like her to people like them as reliably as water moves downhill, and nobody called it theft because nobody had to. Because it happened in a language most people never learned to read. This is not an argument for despair. It is an argument for literacy. The people who escape the dynamic do not escape by working harder than the people who do not. They escape by understanding the mechanism well enough to stop being purely downstream of it. By putting some portion of their resources into things that move with the current rather than things that are eroded by it. By recognizing that the financial advice designed for survival is not the same as the financial strategy practiced by the people who thrive. By learning the language. The language is learnable. It was not always accessible. It is now, at a cost in time and attention that is real but finite. The barrier is not intelligence. The barrier is orientation, the prior belief, installed early and reinforced constantly, that this is a territory that belongs to someone else, that the mechanisms of wealth are complex beyond comprehension, that the correct posture is to trust the institutions and follow the rules and hope that the container does not empty faster than you can fill it. That posture is exactly what the architecture of the system requires of most people in order to function as it does. Compliance is not forced. It is manufactured, through complexity, through the design of financial products that obscure their own mechanics, through educational systems that teach arithmetic but not capital, through a cultural narrative in which wealth is explained as the reward for virtue rather than the product of positioning. The theft is quiet because the targets are kept calm. Not through deception, exactly. Through selective omission. Through the provision of just enough information to make the system navigable at the basic level, and not enough to make it legible at the level where the transfer actually occurs. You are reading this in a moment when more of that information is available than at any prior point in history. The map exists. It has always existed. The question has always been who was shown it. Now you are. What you do with that is the only part of this equation that was ever actually yours.